This is episode 164 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Good to see you again as we are on Legislature Eve. Just remind everybody that no man's life, liberty, or property are safe while the legislature is in session. So
mathematically, it's 1 over Christmas Eve. It's not the same thing. So we're here from the government and we're here to help you. That's been the motto lately in New Mexico.
You got it. We've talked a little bit about what we see coming through this session and some of the bills that'll be introduced and maybe passed. We've got a lot of things to talk about in that regard, but we are very excited about one piece of legislation that's been introduced in the legislative session, and it is the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights by Representative Rod Montoya, the House Republican whip. And while he has slim to none and slim left town in terms of chances of passing his Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, it is very important for conservatives in the legislature to put markers out, put bills out that they want to show where they would go in a different direction from the dominant direction in New Mexico public policy. And the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, we've discussed it ad nauseum, but it is a critical component of kind of turning New Mexico around, is imposing some political, some restraint on spending.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a nice gesture. Hopefully that it will at least get to the point that it is discussed and debated in a committee or two. So we'll have to see about that. It's also not impossible that the thing would die a very quick and undiscussed death. But yeah, it would be a great thing. And New Mexico really has some issues that they need to address with regard to that.
Yeah. And of course, the media's take on the proposal, there was a write-up in the Santa Fe New Mexican, Michael Gerstein, after briefly describing the proposal from Representative Montoya, talked to House Minority Whip Doreen Gallegos, a Democrat from Las Cruces, arguing that the proposal would limit the state's ability to pay for much-needed services such as K-12, higher education, roads, public safety, and social services. And yes, that is exactly what it would do, because we've spent more money for years. We spend more money than our neighboring states. APS spends over $18,000 a pupil to no avail. Our higher education system, ditto. We spend much more than most other states. Our roads, well, we could build more, but we have to train the rail runner, and that's consuming money, as well as Davis-Bacon rules and regulations. And, public safety, that's farcical. These folks consider public safety to be a top priority, and they don't certainly spend that kind of money. And then we have judges that throw people back on the streets. And of course, social services is another name for welfare, and we have that in spades. New Mexico is a very generous state, providing that hammock as opposed to the incentive for people to get back into the workforce. If they're out for a little while, there's nothing wrong with a government program to tide them over, but that's not what New Mexico has traditionally done. So, it won't go anywhere, but with $1.5 billion over the last 2 years going to fund government growth, and I don't think many in New Mexico outside of the government infrastructure will really appreciate that or benefit from that kind of growth. I think it's high time that somebody put forth a proposal to finally put a lid on government spending and growth and give taxpayers the ability to vote on more growth in government. If they want to, they can. People in Colorado, when they've had that chance, generally have not, although several years ago they did approve government taking more of their hard-earned money.
Yeah, and it's interesting. My sense is that the person on the street out there in New Mexico, if you were to ask them how large is New Mexico state's government, either as a percentage of our total state income, gross state product, or per capita, or any other measurement. I think because it's a constant drumbeat, they would say, "Oh yeah, well we're low, we're low. That's why we need to raise it. We need to raise it. We need to raise it." And when in fact the opposite is true, our state government is actually quite large when you look at it in a common size, meaning based on per person, per resident, or dollar revenue come in. And yeah, this is something that would be a definite game changer, and we'll see how much they will even talk about it in Santa Fe. That'll be interesting to see right there. Hopefully they'll get a debate. I think it's a very timely topic, given that we have record revenues. Will we grow forever? Is there an ever increasing amount of the state's wealth that will be consumed by our state government, or will we at some point choose to go another way?
Yeah, and of course, Taxpayers' Bill of Rights is kind of the gold standard. It's the ideal. To do what Colorado did is really the best thing you can do, best single public policy you can input at a state level to grow the economy, grow prosperity. But we do have a number of bills out there, bipartisan in many cases, to move some of the money back to the taxpayers. And I think that's really where the real discussion is going to happen. It's not about whether New Mexico is going to have a Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. Spoiler alert, we're not at least right now. Give us some time. Maybe we'll get something going. But what we need to be talking about is, shouldn't the taxpayers of the state of New Mexico share in some of this prosperity thanks to the oil and gas boom? And the answer, I believe, among the majority is going to be no. The question is, can we A, push them in the right direction, or make them pay at the ballot box? And that has been the frustration of many reform-minded folks, including us at the Rio Grande Foundation, in terms of getting voters to hold the folks accountable that they keep sending back up to Santa Fe.
Yeah, one of the things that is, depending on where you are in the process, either a great thing or a bad thing, is that major legislation anywhere, particularly in New Mexico, doesn't generally happen in one fell swoop.
No.
There have definitely been exceptions. This last session's Energy Transition Act being probably the most notable exception in recent memory. But even if something is a good reform that everyone agrees on, things like that generally don't happen the first time they're introduced. It takes a little while. Legislators remind me kind of old dogs in a new doghouse. Even if it's really nicer, they got to kick it and take a look at it and get used to being in the room. And so in that regard, to even have this on the agenda, I think is a big positive for our state.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will be tracking it and many other pieces of legislation. We'll talk a little bit about some of those bills in a few minutes in this podcast. But on the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights issue, inequality is one of the things that the left supposedly really reviles. They don't like it. In fact, some of the presidential candidates, I know Warren and Sanders, they have put policy proposals out there, Warren in particular, her wealth tax, stating that the idea of that policy is not to necessarily generate more money or any other policy goal. It's more to make sure that the wealthy are not as wealthy and that the poor are less poor. But when you look at state level, it's called the Gini coefficient, G-I-N-I, and I think that might stand for something as an acronym, but it's G-I-N-I, and go to statista.com, and they look at Gini coefficient as a measure for household income distribution inequality for U.S. states as of 2018. Now, they also look at territories, and Puerto Rico, interestingly enough, comes in number one as the most unequal place in the entire country. Kind of makes sense, especially as was reported over the weekend, when they had the hurricane that came through, a lot of aid also was brought into Puerto Rico, and there were complaints that there wasn't enough aid, and yet they found a big warehouse with a lot of it. And Puerto Rico had numerous problems economically. I've been there to the island and multiple occasions, and have some friends still there. A lot of challenges. District of Columbia is the next most, and that one makes sense. You got a lot of real wealthy people and a lot of real poor folks in the District of Columbia. By the way, Puerto Rico and District of Columbia, for all the differences they have, not exactly conservative red state places. District of Columbia does vote for president. I think they may have given President Trump double digits, but that's probably on the outside in terms of how many votes he got. New York is the next most inequality oriented place, highest inequality. Connecticut, theme here of blue states. Now Louisiana, and then California. So really a blue state dominated list there. And then next in line is New Mexico. So we are among U.S. states only, fifth most unequal in the entire country. Blue state domination for decades, and yet here we are, New Mexico, one of the most unequal places in the entire country. Before we move on to our neighbors, I wanted to get your thoughts on that, Wally.
Well, Paul, sociologist Corrado Ginny, when he formulated this
named after somebody
in 1912, yeah, it's a statistic, and like all statistics can be misrepresented. But what I do think that's fascinating, if you look at the top, you would have to say there's some interesting phenomenon in terms of where this happens. The District of Columbia and New York tend to be very wealthy with a lot of poor as well. Mm-hmm. So there's fantastic wealth there. Connecticut, much the same. Now, when you start looking at in California, the same. Some of the highest levels of income and wealth in the world are contained in places like New York and California. Whereas Puerto Rico, Louisiana, New Mexico, we have a poor coefficient of distribution, notwithstanding the fact that we don't tend to have very high levels of income.
Yeah, inequality tends to come about because of you have really wealthy and really poor. That'll drive up your inequality.
Right.
But as you state, Louisiana and New Mexico tend to be, and Puerto Rico just tend to be poor. So you're not, it says a lot about the inequality that you have relatively low level of prosperity. I remember some website did a analysis of the wealthiest person in each state, and the wealthiest person in New Mexico, I know there are oil and gas people, but compared to a lot of other states, they're relatively small potatoes. And there was another study about how much you have to make in New Mexico to be part of the 1%. We had that big debate about
and
the
it's
1%.
very low,
relatively low. Yeah. So that is a fascinating insight there, Wally. But if you haven't already looked at it, Wally, who is the least unequal state in the entire country?
You know what? I have not looked at it, so I would have to go down there. Let's see. Utah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So,
and Alaska is also second. Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota. Very interesting.
Red state.
Yes. And then we get up into Hawaii. That's a fascinating one.
Yeah.
Just because, I don't know, I would have expected Hawaii. Hawaii is the most surprising on that list, because, but who knows, maybe many of the people who own homes in Hawaii aren't considered residents for purposes of this. There's plenty of uber rich that have second, third, fourth, and fifth homes in Hawaii. So maybe the high end of income and wealth doesn't do that. But yeah, it's very interesting. Utah,
our
and
most
Alaska.
unequal neighbor is Texas, and they're maybe 20th most unequal. Then you've got Oklahoma, maybe 30th or so. Arizona, maybe 35th. Colorado is much less unequal than New Mexico, maybe in the 40th range. They don't have numbers right next to them in this particular chart. And then, as I said, Utah, probably some impact from the Mormon, the Latter-day Saints religion and their culture. But regardless, the point is that despite the domination for 70 plus years by the party that claims to care about inequality and bringing the poor up, pushing the wealthy down, New Mexico is one of the most unequal places in the entire country, and is on that list, joined by several other blue states. So really, I think it's interesting data, and I don't expect it'll change a whole lot, regardless of the public policies considered in the 2020 legislative session.
Well, I want to read you a quote, and then that kind of for me will cap this issue. Is communism was a great system for making people equally poor, and in fact, there was no better system in the world than that for communism, making people equally poor. Capitalism made people unequally rich. And that's the whole thing, is like, if your goal is
we are unequally poor, Wally. That's the problem.
That is the problem. You know who's that quote's attributed to? None too conservative an economist, Thomas Friedman.
Oh.
Well, it's like, good job, Tom. 2 thumbs up from the Wally here in terms of, yeah, that really does encapsulate it, is that particularly as you look across large populations, huge places, population-wise, like the entire United States, there are ways to get to income equality. Absolutely. What it would take in terms of everybody being poor, more poor, that's the big question.
And while New Mexico traditionally hasn't had very progressive income taxes, that's one of the few kind of more conservative things that it has. Its income tax has modest progressivity. That fell away largely with the Richardson tax reductions on income in 2003. It was phased in over that time frame. California has by far and away the most progressive income tax structure in the United States, and they find themselves yet again on that list. So inequality is not the interest of the Rio Grande Foundation per se, because it's not something that we particularly value eliminating, or it just doesn't drive our outlook on the world the way it does folks on the left. But I think it's a very interesting thing. I mean, good luck replicating Utah and its approach to inequality. I mean, that's a impossibility involving a lot of cultural and religious norms, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think just getting things done to fundamentally change aspects of the economy that aren't, are you wealthier or are you more poor as a whole, are very, very difficult. So session starts, and I just wanted to flag something for people relating to the session. It was a great opportunity last week, and I would encourage everybody to check this out. We sat down, I did with Channel 7, KOAT, and they said, here's the governor's agenda, which of course I was familiar with, everything from marijuana legalization to the budget and early childhood and free college, et cetera. And then I was given a response opportunity to say where we agreed with her, which we do on pension reform, but where we disagree with her, which is on most of everything else that she's trying to do. Although on marijuana legalization, it's nuanced. We support marijuana legalization at the Rio Grande Foundation, but we don't support it from a cash cow perspective. It should be let people not go to jail. You can have a market in marijuana, but it shouldn't be seen as a generator of government revenue. So great opportunity for the Rio Grande Foundation to literally respond to what the governor is proposing in the 2020 legislative session. And I applaud Channel 7 for asking us and for giving us an opportunity to shed some light on some of these important policies.
Yeah, and this term is so politicized. They do not mean it in such a way. Yeah, hats off to them. This is fair and balanced. This is a different perspective, and not that it's the only one. I'm sure they could get people that said that the governor's. I know they're out there. I've talked to them sometimes. That the governor's plan is unambitious, and we ought to spend twice the money that she's proposing. But I think that is a good sign, local media outlet to be taking a look at the issue in these times of record revenues and what we're going to do with it from a few different perspectives.
And speaking of those record revenues, Wally, yet another kind of measuring stick by which we get to show just how impressive what's going on in New Mexico is. Of course, our friends at the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, and they sent out a press release last week. It's just so mind-blowing how this industry has transformed New Mexico's economy from a revenue-generating perspective. I don't think the average person sees a tremendous difference walking down the street. You don't see, and I think if you did have this kind of boom in Arizona or Colorado, you would see cranes and new buildings under construction and some tangible items. But in New Mexico, really, you see the numbers on the state budget going ever upward. But I wouldn't say that in my area of Albuquerque or driving around, you say, we're in a boom time. This is all happening. Wally,
yes, yeah, and I've thought a lot about this and we'll talk a little bit more about the percentage and what that means in a minute. But in a lot of places that have headquarters and they grow the administration to keep up with the on the ground, in the factory, the plant growth, all of the production of oil and gas growth is happening in southeast New Mexico. And to the extent that these companies are reinvesting, they're reinvesting in two places. One, back into the Permian Basin, drilling more new wells with the revenues they got and the ability to borrow more money based on their financial circumstances. But to the extent they need to add engineering offices and administrative support, that doesn't happen in New Mexico for a variety of reasons. One, it historically has not happened here because, frankly, Midland, Odessa was closer to the overall Permian Basin, and then a lot of the companies that are in oil and gas have tended to be headquartered in places like Houston primarily, but some even in Dallas. J.R. Ewing, shout out there. So we don't see any of that kind of secondary effect come within the industry.
And I'll say this, Wally, just to jump in real quick on this. I was down in Carlsbad last summer, Carlsbad, New Mexico, and drove through. I didn't stay there because if you do look for a hotel room,
you have a hard time, or
very difficult.
Two things: you either can't find one, or if you do, it's $200 or $300 or $400 depending on the evening.
And the traffic was pretty bad.
Yeah,
but just the average person seeing the bad traffic and the high cost of hotel rooms in Carlsbad, New Mexico, you don't automatically think, gosh, I can tell Carlsbad, New Mexico is in a real boom situation. You don't see high-rise buildings going up in Carlsbad, New Mexico. You don't see all that much construction going on in Carlsbad. Maybe a hotel or two. You don't see a great deal of improvement in Carlsbad's a lovely place, but you don't see the buildings suddenly gleaming and the sidewalks clean and everybody's upkeeping and things look great. Now, I don't know if that's more of a function of the industry itself and just kind of it's more of a blue collar type of industry, or if it's just the money flowing in to the government and people who look at New Mexico as the latest place to go and live and work, and that they're going to be out of there in a year or 5 years or whatever it might be. Because when you see booms happen, and I lived in Washington, D.C. for 8.5 years, that place always has boom, construction going
Yeah,
on.
they're building commercial real estate.
You just
like
don't see that
crazy.
kind of thing either in the Permian Basin areas and those communities or in the rest of New Mexico. I mean, Albuquerque, we have a downtown. We don't have a lot of tall buildings going up. We don't have a lot of inherent construction. Downtown isn't suddenly revitalized in some noticeable and tangible way in Albuquerque. So just kind of.
Well, and I think these perspectives are pretty similar in that the same thing that would keep a corporate headquarters out of Albuquerque would tend to keep a field office out of Carlsbad or Hobbs if you already have one in Midland, Odessa. And the reason is technology. It's the connected nature of technology. The companies that drill oil wells in the Permian Basin, the folks on site get to see that, but there's a live feedback to headquarters wherever that is. So there's a control room of their top engineering people monitoring that every step of the way. And it's interesting. It's almost like the opportunity to get those kind of that service business and those support locations and those headquarters has come and gone. From now on, you only need one of those, maybe across the world, and they're not in New Mexico. So we'll drill a lot of oil wells here, and we'll have some level of infrastructure to support that. But the overwhelming majority of it's going to be direct, meaning those are oil wells. We're drilling holes, we're putting casing down, we're building pipelines, and not as much of the secondary type of growth that you allude to. So I think that, and that is not likely to change. The technology to communicate is not going away, and the headquarters are not here right now. And frankly, there's no inherent reason that it makes more sense to put your next network operations center in Albuquerque. There's gross receipts tax and other problems. And
I wonder how much of this is technology, as you said, and not needing to have that kind of physical presence versus the policies. Now, obviously, policies haven't changed. Policies could change. What would happen if we changed our policies? Would we see more of that kind of development? Secondly, and didn't get an opportunity to do this, but another state about a decade ago was really transformed by a boom in oil and gas production, North Dakota. Now, you can look at the economic data and see obvious signs that North Dakota not only changed dramatically during that boom time, but it remains fundamentally changed. It's also the second leading oil producer in the entire country, only to Texas, and we're third. Now, was there something different about North Dakota? Obviously, North Dakota's got a more business-friendly public policy environment than New Mexico. I don't know how many headquarters or field offices or whatnot, but my point is, you just don't. The signs that we are in an epic boom in the oil and gas industry are not readily apparent if you just go driving around either Albuquerque, Santa Fe, down in the southeast part of the state. You read it in the articles, you see it in the government data and the numbers, and maybe if you're involved in selling government furniture, for example, as my wife does, you'd see some of that. But anyway, we're going to get into the data. New Mexico Oil and Gas Association. State revenue from oil and gas is up 41% since just last year, which, by the way, was also a boom year. Oil and gas production in New Mexico generated about $3.1 billion in revenue for the state last year. The first time such revenue surpassed $3 billion. And that is from our friends Richard Anklem and the New Mexico Tax Research Institute.
And assuming that Richard is using the same methodology that they've used for years, and I see nothing from this press release. I didn't catch a link to the detailed study. I'm sure that'll be coming out soon. But assuming that he used the same methodology that he's been using, that number is very conservative. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of things in there that are very difficult to catch. Those are the ones that are that you can directly point and say, yeah, here's a code in the state system that this is oil and gas. So whatever these numbers are, they are, if anything, conservative. And Paul, I don't know if you know, I worked with Richard to build the initial study along this. We scoped it out, and by design, it is very conservative. And so the fact that it's so high it does not. There's no way that it overstates the importance of the industry. If
Yep.
anything, it understates it.
So the last 2 years saw oil and gas revenue for the state increase to $2.2 billion in 2018 and $3.1 billion in 2019. As you mentioned, it's not just limited to direct impacts. There are data for gross receipts tax collections because, as we've talked about with pyramiding, you put a pump jack into the ground, and that is taxed on the gross receipts tax.
And that would be captured in all likelihood. What wouldn't be captured is the gross receipts tax from the catering company that sold food or snacks or drinks or whatever on that drilling site. So there's a lot that just are not captured in this methodology.
So according to the NMOGA report, $326 million or 12.2% of the gross receipts tax collected in the state directly comes from oil and gas. So that's incredible. Everybody pays gross receipts tax on everything they purchase, more or less, not groceries, not a lot of other things that are exempted. But when it comes to going to the store and buying, something, you pay gross receipts tax, and 12.2% of that being gross receipts from oil and gas is quite impressive. $127 million or 7.2% of the personal income tax was generated via the oil and gas industry. And $555 million was generated for the oil and gas school tax, with $29 million coming from oil and gas conservation tax and $15 million from the natural gas processors tax. So these are all subcomponents of the way we tax more directly oil and gas coming out of the ground. But just a remarkable growth in this industry, remarkable growth for New Mexico and its bottom line. And there's a lot of good there, but there's also, as we are wont to say at the Rio Grande Foundation, what are we going to do, our policymakers going to do, to ensure that as we have this money, this opportunity, once in the history of our state, to make New Mexico a more attractive place for business, attractive place to live, solve some of the fundamental challenges that we've had for many, many years, decades. So far, I don't see it. I see a lot of spending and not much of it that's going to do a lot of good for the long-term future of our state.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is... we always said we couldn't reform gross receipts tax because state revenues were so tight that we couldn't chance it.
Yep.
Now we can't. Now that reason is gone. We'll have to come up with a new reason not to do it. But the whole point of this is, and the reason, they talk about diversifying the economy. The reason that you want to diversify the economy is presumably that the economy, if the oil and gas industry takes a big hit, which it inevitably does, it has many times over history, it will again at some point, it just doesn't take your state back to the fiscal Stone Age. You're able to have some. And that part of the growth and investment in the states, as you say, walk around Albuquerque. Where are the new high rises going in? Where's the new big economic development? On the podcast in various forums they've done, looked at from a lot of perspectives, income growth, population, et cetera. Most of the state's pretty stagnant, taking away the Southeast New Mexico. And much of the state actually is contracting, but for Southeast New Mexico when it comes to the financial aspect. Yeah,
because, as much as Grants and Gallup struggle, Marcy's Farmington may be struggling, they are still seeing cash infusions. All that economic development money that's supposed to come into the Four Corners to help soften the blow from the unnecessary phase out of that power plant. All that money is coming from the oil and gas industry as well. If oil and gas takes a nosedive down to $20 a barrel and stays there for an extended period of time, you think the Four Corners is going to keep getting all that economic development money? No chance. All right. Well, we got a few minutes to go in the program, and I want to share a few bills that are, I guess you could call them rattling around the roundhouse. Simply put, these are bills that are introduced that have an opportunity, they could go forward. They're not necessarily directly things that the governor has talked about, but you start out any legislative session, it's a crapshoot. You just don't know what is going to come about at the end of it. The governor may be talking about marijuana legalization, but that doesn't mean that other policies aren't going to make their way to the finish line. And we're going to just, in no particular order, talk about some bills that some of them are good. This one's not. But HB 173, that is Matthew McQueen, Representative McQueen, would like to increase the gas tax. That has been discussed in many years, in previous years. And it's not a surprise that folks in Santa Fe would like to see more taxation, more revenue flow in. We're hopeful that at least Republicans say no to higher taxes. That hasn't always been the case. We had HB 6 last year with $1 billion surplus, so there's no necessary reason that they won't consider raising taxes yet again this year. But this proposal would impose an additional gas tax on top of what we already have, 10 cents starting in 2021, 15 in 2022, 20, 25, 30 cents all the way up to 2025 is when it would be an additional 30 cents per gallon, thanks to Representative McQueen. I can assure you that if any Republican goes along with this, we will scream from the mountaintops. We'll work to oppose it regardless, but it is a yet another bad idea. The money, as we've said, just a portion of that oil and gas money could easily pay for infrastructure, especially in southeast New Mexico, but also around the state to the extent that it's needed.
Yeah, and we've talked about this. It's I know the Rio Grande Foundation has a nuanced and subtle position and definitely speak to progressivity of taxes, that you're not always for taxes being progressive in every case. But the left always seems to put progressive taxes in the form of income taxes as huge and high on their virtue signaling. That's the best. It's always good to have that higher. And yet in New Mexico, a lot of things like these gasoline taxes are actually very regressive, meaning the poorer you are, the more likely you are to spend a higher percentage of your income because of this tax on whatever is being put forward. And so it is very interesting.
Right.
New Mexico doesn't necessarily toe the progressive party line when it comes to that element of taxation. It's interesting.
Well, I didn't mention this because it was kind of beyond the scope, but McQueen actually has some kind of a rebate system, a mechanism in that for lower income taxpayers. So he does attempt through the gas tax to address that issue. That doesn't mean that it's going to work very well. And of course, it's going to be very expensive to have and time consuming for the people out driving, the lower income folks who would have to pay that tax. But
much less the bureaucracy to administer that.
It is addressed in the legislation.
All right, very good. Well, good to know, but not necessarily good. And that's one of those.
Right.
Odds are the benefit of having that in there would be eaten away by so much more huge bureaucratic expense, and that to make that not worthwhile.
Yeah.
So.
HB 51 and SB 93. Now, these HB 51 and SB 93 are ethnic studies addition to meet PED, Public Education Department requirements. So basically, you have to add a couple of years of ethnic studies to the curriculum at New Mexico's schools. 51 is Patricia Roybal Caballero, who is maybe wins the award for my worst legislator in the entire legislature, which is quite a high bar indeed. But she's yeah, she's awful. Linda Lopez is introducing this in the Senate. Normally, I wouldn't even talk about a Roybal Caballero bill because they're all so bad and so thoughtless. But the fact that she does have a co-sponsor over in the Senate, ethnic studies as a subject area tends to be just we hate white people, we hate the founding of this country, and pretty much anything that is recognizable as inherently American. It's not really going to get anybody a job long term. It's not going to result in a better trained workforce. It's just more politicization of our education system, and it's not something that our legislature should be mandating as a requirement for graduation.
Well, and as you said, who knows what ethnic studies even is? It tends to be some typically far left approach to things. But one of the things is having grown up with a public school education in New Mexico and taking social studies in 8th grade, which was where New Mexico history was primarily covered. You can't do the history of New Mexico without ethnic studies, and the entire early history of New Mexico was this interaction between the Spanish and Native American elements, because guess what? That's who was here. Mm-hmm. And so, compared to maybe some other states that have to go way further back or deeper, whatever, that was a huge part of our culture in New Mexico. And I think, frankly, I don't remember any talk of the basic gringo approach to where the state is now, that influence at all and all of that. It's possible we already have that in our curriculum.
Yeah, well, I don't think my kids have started on New Mexico history just yet, and that'll be something I'm interested to watch as they move their way through the system. And I'm no expert on New Mexico history, but I'd like to hopefully have an impact in correcting any misperceptions. We've only got time for a few. There's more bills out there, and these are just some of the highlights or lowlights. HB 16 would impose new taxes on employers to pay for paid family and medical leave for their employees. There'd be a new bureaucracy set up to do that. SB 18 would actually impose an excise tax on electricity generated from renewable energy sources and distribute that revenue to the newly set up early childhood permanent fund, which is fascinating that they're going to tax so-called renewables. And SB 91, Linda Lopez, would ban the sale, purchase, or provision of free samples, or just banning the sale of e-cigarettes that have flavoring in them as well. So those are some.
So I'm going to have to buy my own sample e-cigarettes. Wow, that's something.
And there's a couple of bills that are worth something on Social Security. You've got HB 29, which is a Social Security income tax exemption. Catherine Brown, representative, and Gail Armstrong, representative as well. There are bipartisan bills out there on Social Security and eliminating that taxation of Social Security. So that's good news. HB 77 is Damon Eli and Bill Tallman's bill. I'm sure it's a little more modest than the Republican version. And then Michael Padilla and James White have one as, let's see what the number is on that one. SB 68, so truly bipartisan legislation. And then HB 130 exempt Social Security income from the income tax. So Gail Armstrong and Rebecca Dow have that one. So a number of efforts to eliminate or dramatically reduce taxes on Social Security. So there's a lot of bills out there. Many of them, the ones that get votes, will certainly be rated on a -8 to +8 on our Freedom Index. But right now, folks can go to nmlegis.gov and look through all the pre-filed bills. There's still going to be more bills. I went through some of the highlights or lowlights. There's a lot of other impactful bills I tried to cover some of the bills that, given the current legislative makeup and the priorities of the governor, that I think might get some serious consideration. But there's plenty of bad bills that will be discussed and possibly passed, and there's maybe a handful of good bills. We'll see what shakes loose.
Yeah, absolutely. I know there's another hydraulic fracturing ban bill
Another
out there.
ban.
There's a lot of things,
Yep.
will it get traction? Probably not. But no, I think that's a good starting point because, as you say, they either have to be germane to the creation of the budget, the fiscal aspects, or the governor has to call for it. And there's a lot of things out there that probably won't meet either one of those.
You got it. Well, thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing the show.